Ty Gagne, how's it going?
Good, thanks, Jake. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to get you on the podcast. I've been wanting to talk to you for literally years about so many things related to the White Mountains, but to sort of explain who you are the preeminent writer related to tragedy and harrowing experiences in the White Mountains, I would say.
Thank you for that. I don't view myself that way, but thank you for that. That compliment. I appreciate it. It's humbling.
Well, your new book, The Lions of Winter, which I definitely want to get into, it's your third book about survival and in some cases, unfortunately, not survival in our local mountains. And to have an author on who has the depth of knowledge of the mountains that I can practically see from my office, it's so cool. You hear about these far-flung, adventures and misadventures, and you read about them from all over the world. But then to read about it from in our backyard is just incredibly interesting.
I'm glad you enjoy them, and I'm really passionate about sharing these stories and talking with the people that involved with them and the subject matter experts around the topics I'm writing about. So yeah, thank you.
And you're not an interloper or anything. You live here, right? Where do you live?
I live now down toward the seacoast in that area of New Hampshire. I've lived in New Hampshire my whole life. I grew up in central New Hampshire and had really easy access to the White Mountains at that point.
And you've been hiking and climbing in the White Mountains for your whole life, right?
I would say it started when my parents moved my sister and I to central New Hampshire, and you have that first classic family hike up Rattlesnake Mountain.
Wait, which rattlesnake? Because there's 7 rattlesnakes.
The one overlooking Squam and Holderness.
The one that everybody hikes, yeah.
Yeah. But then you end up, once you discover rock climbing, you're drawn to Rattlesnake and Rumney. So
the other rattlesnake, which is so ironic because there aren't rattlesnakes in New Hampshire, but there are so many rattlesnake mountains.
Yeah.
What's that about?
I don't know. Is it the switchback nature of some of those trails? I don't know.
See, that's why you're the White Mountains scholar and I'm not.
Yeah, but I'm speculating. But now you have me curious. So.
There's your next book.
Yeah, right. So I think from that first hike you do with your family, that then kind of leads to Morgan and Percival and that whole area, and the Ridgepole Trail across the road is what is just, I love it there. But then you have that class trip in 4th grade where you're going to a 4,000 footer. You don't really know what you're taking on there, but and then it just progressed from there.
The thing about hiking in New Hampshire is there are so many objectives that are available on so many different difficulty levels. And I definitely want to get into this, but it kind of lulls you in a little bit, doesn't it? Where you're the hike up Rattlesnake's no big deal. Morgan Percival across the way is not that big of a deal. And even things like the Lafayette Ridge in good weather, not that big of a deal. 9-mile round trip. But when the weather goes bad, it goes real bad.
Yeah, it does. And then I think even for a fair weather hike, underestimating the terrain that we find ourselves in, which is so easily accessible to 80 million people, days drive, it doesn't take long to get over your head.
It really doesn't. And I've noticed that in Franconia Notch, where I'd be I'd have a great day up in Franconia, climbing on Cannon or something. And then I'll be this is my life now. I go to Franconia and I have great days. And then I'll go the next day and I'll be wallowing through waist deep snow that's not working with my snowshoes, or I'm on some sketchy ice climb that I'm how did I find myself here? You can have such nice days followed by such heinous days.
Yeah, but we think about and talk about the heinous days, right? I mean, those are the ones, the bookmarks.
It's so much easier to write about a movie you don't like than to write about a movie that you do like.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, because nobody wants to read about, it was a nice day. It was fun. It was great. It was enjoyable. It's the struggle that is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's the approach I take with the stories is Yes, I'm writing about tragedy. I'm writing about survival, but I think those are the stories that offer so much learning, so much opportunity for self-reflection. Again, like you said, you're not going to necessarily tell the story of everything that went well because yes, we might glean lessons from them, but you might not necessarily stay with that narrative. So
That's really interesting because as we were chatting online about, getting you on the podcast, I said I had just read The Last Traverse, the one about the Lafayette Ridge. And I caught myself being really critical of the people who were involved in that disaster, one of whom lost his life and the other of whom his life is completely changed. And I found myself like I was being really critical. And then I caught myself and I was like, I mean, I've probably made a lot of the mistakes that these people made. And you responded saying, yes, you have, Jay. And I was like, you are absolutely right. Like, we've all made these mistakes, I think. You're in the mountains long enough, you're going to start making a lot of the pretty common mistakes.
yeah, and I think so. In the case of the story of the Last Traverse, I had been on that ridge line the week before James Osborne and Fred Fredrickson, and I should not have been there. It was full conditions. I was with two people I didn't know. I had been invited to go with them, and I wanted to turn around multiple times. My fitness, I'd been up there in gnarly weather before. I liked it, but I was with my trusted climbing partner, who was my middle school industrial arts teacher that introduced me to rock climbing. And here I'm still I consider my climbing partner and mentor in the mountains. And I should not have been there. I wanted to turn around. And for all of these reasons you get in your head, I just couldn't bring myself to end their day early because I had placed myself in invited guest mode. And that happens in the mountains and it happens at sea level. It's the same stuff. It's just magnified above tree line.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is applicable to climbing as well. A lot of the, our listeners are avid climbers. And I mean, like these heuristics that you talked about, which you're mentioning, one, the expert halo heuristic, right? Where you're going with your mentor and your mentors. I mean, I'm assuming this is the case in this scenario where your mentor is like, yeah, let's go. It's fine. And, maybe as somebody who's less experienced, if you're not feeling good about it, you're less likely to speak up. And I thought about that when I was reading about it. And I was like, the expert halo heuristic, like that happens every time I go rock climbing with somebody less experienced than me. I'm like, oh, it's fine. Like
Right.
I'm the one who's like creating this heuristic that's negative for my partner. So like I need to sort of assess that a little better.
Yeah, I think two things to that point, because my mentor wasn't with me on the ridge. And
Oh, okay.
right, but if we talk about that climbing relationship that we have, I mean, we've been on routes before and one pulled the plug without judgment. We've been slated to go out for a winter hike or an ice climb, and the conditions just didn't look good. And so the one calls the other, pulls the plug, no judgment. We've been on routes, and because we have, and I think you'll fully appreciate this, because we have that high trust, we have assumed more risk because we have that chemistry. And on the expert halo side, when we are with somebody less experienced and the leader or perceived expert makes a statement like we're fine, that immediately ceases any chance that follower is going to express concern or reservations around what we're asking them to do. And oftentimes, a novice will see things that the expert doesn't see because the expert has arrived at this place of complacency because, oh, it's a 5'6", I do 5'11", I got this. But again, that follower sees something that the expert doesn't.
That's such a thing. I'm reminded of a route at Devil's Lake that I used to. It was on my solo circuit. It was like a 5.7, and it was like I had it pretty well dialed. And there was this loose block that like you'd like through the crux, you'd stem up and you'd reach up to the loose block and you'd grab it and match it and hang on it. And like it was like, but it was loose, but you could hang
Yeah.
on it. It's been loose forever. And I remember talking to somebody being like, yeah, don't worry about it. It's been loose forever. It's no big deal. And then I found out later, like that block fell out. Like,
Yeah.
somebody on top rope or whatever pulled the block out. And I was like, geez, that was a situation where I was completely complacent about the potential objective risk just from experience, like just from my experience of like, oh, it's always been that way. So therefore it will stay that way. Like that's a fallacy.
Yeah, I agree. And every time we do something and nothing happens bad, we're normalizing that behavior. So that loose block has never been a problem for you. It's that next time that it becomes a problem, and everything kind of falls apart, right?
That's why I have such a hard time with backcountry skiing because I mean, I took the AVI class, and which I learned like you're always at risk of avalanche. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, it's always a concern. And like the feedback loop is so messed up on backcountry skiing because like poor decisions will result in like oftentimes incredible skiing, right? So like, the avalanche laden slope, the slope that might slide could be great skiing, or you could get swept up in an avalanche and that would
Yeah.
be it. So like, 100 times, 99 times out of 100, you're going to have great skiing. And then one time you're going to die. And like, that's a really hard decision tree for me.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things with that. I'll go back to it, kind of ties into the Lions of Winter book, but I think part of it is too, when we do something and we get away with it, one of two things can happen. We kind of bury that and we move forward, and that might bolster our confidence. But if we actually take time to reflect on, wow, I just got through that by the skin of my teeth, and what brought me there, what actually drove me to launch, and what can I learn from that experience that I can take into the next backcountry situation that I have. But I think to your point of backcountry skiing, I have not skied for years, but I spent with the Lions story in particular and my research. I mean, I was talking to search and rescue personnel who, backcountry skiing is what they do. And now I have this real urge to get out. I haven't skied in years, but now I want to go ski in the backcountry because I've heard so much about it and it just sounds epic. But there's so much risk associated with it if you're going in unprepared or unknowing.
And I feel like with the climbing risks, these are risks that are by and large, like I knew that block was loose. Like
Yeah.
it's front and center. It's like right in front of your eyes. Like you can see what's going on. Whereas the risk in backcountry skiing, like this is something that lurks literally under the surface. And you're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if there's a giant shark under the water there that's about to get me, like that's
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see some data particularly out of the Mount Washington Observatory. You're seeing a higher frequency of rain on snow events, which is creating more instability in the snowpack. So areas that might seem completely safe, or there may be new risks emerging there. But we think, well, I've always skied that section. I've never had a problem, but the terrain it's changing.
that's absolutely true. And maybe that's a good segue. It's maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but reading about the Lions of Winter and the way that it's focused on the really famous like rescue and tragedy of there being a rescuer who passed during this rescue, and Albert Dow passed in an avalanche. And this is an avalanche, and I was like trying to figure out exactly where it was. It's on Lion's Head, like in the trees.
Yeah, it was an area, going back 43 years, we did not have the access to the snow science that we have today, the avalanche forecasting, the tools to increase safety in the backcountry that, again, all of these teams and backcountry recreators have access to. But it was the Lion Head. There's the classic Lion Head summer route, hiking route. There's what we know today as the winter route. But back then, the winter route was actually, if you're looking at Lionhead feature, the new winter route is to the right of the summer route. The prior winter route, which was back in the 80s, was to the left, and it was a much more vertical, straight up ascent. And this incident tragedy occurred to the left of that in terrain, as you said, in essentially in the trees below a cliff feature that no one had ever known to slide before, because it actually wasn't an area people even went into. But the two, Albert Dow and Michael Hartrick, had completed their search area and were just trying to get down in bad weather and low visibility, and went across this slope that just seemed innocuous. I mean, and it let go.
And then you have pictures in the book, of that slope, and it does look innocuous.
Yeah.
It's a wooded slope. And the thought is that like glades don't really slide, right? Because the trees are supposedly holding it in, but like they do.
Well, and what we know now that we didn't know then about birch glades is that birch really represents regrowth, new growth. And so what that would tell us today is that something moved through there, whether it was in the spring with mud or rocks or landslide, whatever, or avalanche, whatever it was. We could look at that today and know, okay, that might be an area I need to be particularly cautious in. But they didn't know that back then,
Oh, right, because birch wouldn't be old growth. Like
Yeah.
it would be evidence of a slide having happened historically there.
Yeah, some type of activity there that would have brought the prior growth down.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that I've always thought about in the Whites, like climbing, ice climbing up in Mount Washington or hiking or running or whatever, I always have in the back of my mind, if something goes wrong, just go down. Like get down into the trees, and this would be an example of them doing that and that not working, which is concerning for me.
Yeah, yes. And the good thing is you're reflecting on that. You're thinking about it.
I wouldn't have if I didn't read your book, Ty.
Yeah.
You're making me reflect on it. So thanks.
Yeah, okay. Well, but I think if we look at, let's go to the last traverse, they're on Franconia Ridge when they're overtaken by this really rapid onset of a squall. There are a couple of options. You turn around and follow the ridge back. You bail into Pemi Wilderness, not an awesome option, or you go into Walker Ravine, and that's really steep. And all of these areas, it's almost like there's risk in staying above tree line and being exposed, but there's also going to be risk of getting below tree line and dealing with, I mean, you mentioned waist deep snow,
Yeah,
steep terrain that you're completely unfamiliar with, but you go there because you're escaping what you see as a threat to your safety in your life.
that's a tough one. That book, The Last Traverse, explaining what year was that when that occurred?
2008.
2008, right. So the 2008 tragedy of the two who were hiking the Lafayette Ridge counterclockwise, right? Like they
Yeah.
were going up the Falling Waters and then down Bridle Path. And one of them was very experienced, the other wasn't. And they got benighted and stuck up on the ridge. And I don't get it. Like, so for the one with Hugh Hare, where they, went up Odell's, right? And then they were
Yeah.
in the Alpine Garden. Like the Alpine Garden is one of the few places in New Hampshire where every time I'm there, I'm like, whoa, this is scary. Like if weather came in, I wouldn't know where to go unless I had a compass, which I always do with me at that point. But like, I don't get the Lafayette Ridge one because it's like, you just turn around. Like, it's not that committing, really. I mean, maybe this is just me talking with, making wild assumptions that are completely incorrect, but it doesn't seem like that big of a deal.
So I think let's talk about the dynamic between the two, because Fred Fredrickson was much more experienced than James. They were co-workers. They worked for Concord Coach. They were very close friends. And Fred was taking James on what would be James's first winter hike, which he very much wanted to do. And they're just at the base of Lincoln, getting ready to ascend Lincoln on the ridge line, and the squall hits, and Fred identifies immediately the need to turn around and go the less than probably a half mile back to to Little Haystack and descend Falling Waters. He's very familiar with the terrain. He's got a plan.
He
Even
did
so,
the hike like a week prior.
by himself, right? The
Yeah.
day after I had my debacle, he was up, and this is why the story has just resonated with me for so long, because I was in the midst of beating myself up for being there through that entire week, and then the Fredrickson Osborne incident happens, and I'm watching this play out on the news, and it just really fed, it just really enhanced my self-criticism.
It's like there, but for the grace of God go I.
Yeah. But I think what he devises a plan, and as you can imagine, it's a complete whiteout. There's a ground blizzard. There's snow falling. The winds go from 10 miles an hour from the southeast at their backs to 50, 60 plus miles an hour on their left flank. And Fred communicates and executes the bailout plan, and they start to go, and James just freezes with fear. It's that flight, fight, or flee, or freeze. And James freezes. He can't see. There's no sense of spatial awareness. I mean, they're standing in an extreme snow globe, for lack of a better term. And Fred comes back to him and says, "We've got to keep going." And James is very adamant. "We've got to find shelter now. We're going to die. The wind's going to kill. We've got to find shelter now. We can't go back." We put ourselves in Fred's shoes. Here's one of my closest friends who I brought for their first winter hike, who is terrified. It then becomes a lot more complex, that decision to benight, which they didn't think they were benighting. They thought,
yeah, they were just,
we'll drop onto the lee side, get into some shelter. This thing's going to pass, as they sometimes do. This one did not. And it was, what trailed it was an Arctic cold front that further, paralyzes them there. And yeah, it's awful situation.
That's really the X factor of our mountains, isn't it? Where, I mean, you'd be surprised you're not in Alaska up there in bad weather, right? Like the weather comes in quick, and it comes in mean, in the winter. And it just changes everything. Like a bluebird day out in our mountains, they seem like small mountains, right? Like,
yeah.
But then you're there when a cold front comes in, or any of the numerous storm tracks that could converge on our White Mountains, and it's a completely different story.
Yeah, and I think when we promote the White Mountains, and this is not a criticism, but when we promote them, we are showing beauty. We're showing peace. We're showing nature. There is another, like, as you said, there's an ugly side to that, people don't necessarily realize unless they do the research. And again, I would say hundreds of thousands of people go in. If we look at it from a pure frequency, severity, through a risk management lens, hundreds of thousands of people go into the White Mountains every year. And the majority of them come out of that experience unscathed. The ones we pay attention to are the higher profile ones where things go completely wrong, or where that frequency that we see, news broadcasts or articles or social media posts about, hey, a search and rescue team was up there again, bringing someone down the mountain. And then we think, well, this happens all the time. It doesn't happen all the time, given the volume of people that go in to the backcountry.
Our conversations have really made me examine my criticism of people who get in trouble in the mountains. And I am critical of that. Like, I look at it and I'm like, well, they did this, this, and this. Like, I don't know. What's that about, Ty?
Well, then I think
that's a natural response, isn't it?
Well, it is to anything. I mean, it's, if we can criticize or label something as wrong or bad, we don't that, because I've kind of watched you go through this process when you first reached out to me and said, I'm kind of feeling critical about this.
Yeah.
And I went back with you, like, you've made those mistakes. But when we do that, that allows us to not have to deal with our own stuff.
Oh, which is very much me, by the way.
Yeah.
Not dealing with my own stuff in any way possible.
Which is completely normal. But you're going through this process of, reflecting and saying, well, I have done that stuff. And maybe, for those that criticize people that get into trouble in the mountains, and a portion of those folks are not hikers or climbers or going to the backcountry. But if I sat with them, or any of us sat together and said, well, has there been an instance in any aspect of your life where you did something well intended or expected a specific outcome, and it didn't end that way? It didn't play out that way. And we all have those.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And I'm very transparent about my week before in 2008. It's the prologue of the first book I wrote, because I just, if I'm going to be writing about these stories and looking at decision making, I'm going to own my negative mountain experience, which has actually become a real positive for me because I learned a lot from it.
The first book you wrote was Where You'll Find Me, right? About Kate.
Yeah. Matrosova.
Yeah, and she was doing the northern prezzies in the winter, which is not nothing. Like, in terms of the objectives in our area, like the northern prezzies are like really rugged.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and tends to get overlooked because I think the attention stops at 6,200 feet. Like, the attention is drawn to and stops at Mount Washington.
Yep.
But I think the northern prezzies are an animal unto themselves.
Oh, I've done the presidential traverse just in the summer, like numerous times. And they're like, oh, you ran the presidential traverse? And it's like, well, sure, we could really broaden the definition of what running is, but there's not really running from Madison through Adams, like that's mostly just like trying not to trip in like the unending talus.
Right.
It's such a rough trail.
It is. But yeah, I think there's a lot, like the northern, if you look at images of the northern prezzies from Mount Washington, particularly in the winter and lower light, it's mysterious, right? And we're drawn to it, but it's risky terrain, right? As all of it is, but that area in particular, I think.
Yeah. And so she was planning a traverse of the northern prezzies in the winter. She was very fit, experienced, but her experience was, and here I am being critical again, like to anyone listening, I apologize, but like this is just my interaction with the information, is like her experience was all on guided expeditions, like amazing guided expeditions, but she wasn't really making decisions on her own.
Yes. And so the interesting part of that story is the lens with which readers look through, because there are readers that read, oh my gosh, so much experience, so highly experienced, and look what happened. And then there are others that say, and I brought this out in the book, there was experience with a mentor like, or a figure like a guide who essentially assumes the risk and the responsibility for decision making. And I've said this before, experiences in the backcountry, experiences in the mountain don't necessarily equate to having backcountry experience. It's progression. And I think climbing is such a great example of the identification of risk, the managing of it, the decision making around it, and the progression within that sport. It's so visible with climbing in particular.
And tangible, right? Like,
yes,
it's actually like we can chart the grades. Yeah, like in hikes, you can't really, it's so much more subjective as to whether hiking Mount Madison is easier or harder than Mount Adams. There's not really like a grade associated with it, but like the Prow is much harder than Repentance or, Recompense, I suppose. Like, because one's 5'11", one's 5'9". Like, it's so much easier to quantify it in a climbing realm.
Yes, and I think it's because of the ratings, because, might start out at 5'2", 5'3", like, and you build that confidence and you start to build technical experience, and okay, 5'6" and 9. You've gone through that process, and that's why I love climbing in particular in relation to risk, because it's just,
which I got to tell you, it kind of messes with the ice climbing part of it, kind of messes with me because you do one water ice 5 or whatever on a sunny day when it's fairly plastic, and you're like, this is who I am now. I'm a water ice 5 climber. And then you go to Willoughby on a cold, windy day, and you're like, I'm so not. I don't know what I was thinking.
Why am I being humbled? This
exactly.
is awful.
I don't want to be humbled. I thought I was over that.
Right. What resonates with me in particular.
The subjectivity of the risk profile.
Yeah, because with climbing and then finding a way, because there are hikers that read The Lions of Winter because there is a really heavy climbing aspect in that book, but trying to take technical ice and rock climbing and make it relatable to someone who doesn't do that and doesn't necessarily understand it, and then weaving risk through that. I find that really rewarding to work through.
I think that your books are really strikingly good at that because, I mean, I'm reading it from a climber's perspective, being like, okay, so this is my experience and this is how I'm assessing their decisions. But my mom loves your books too because she's a hiker and she's actually in Patagonia right now on a trek, and she loves reading your book. She's so excited that you were on the podcast because she's looking at it from a hiking standpoint and is like, maybe I would be in these situations and wouldn't have, the knowledge had I not read the books. So she loves your book. She's a big fan.
Well, thank you. And hi, Mom. I hope you're enjoying your trip. So thank you so much.
So Kate she did Mount Madison. And if you don't know the area, you go up. Valley Way is the easiest way to get up there, which, as an aside, is like the worst trail in the White Mountains, I think. I hate Valley Way.
Well, and in the wintertime, the ice bulges can get pretty significant just there. I mean, yeah.
Below the hut, right? Like down. Yep. Yeah. So you hike up Valley Way to the Madison hut, and then you bang a left and you head up Mount Madison, which you just tag the summit, and then you come back down the same way you came and go back to the hut, and then continue on your traverse off to the south, to the right as you're hiking up.
Yeah, and in this case it was Star Lake, which is the difficult ascent up that side of Adams in the winter.
Right. So Star Lake would be more on the eastern side of Adams rather than the regular. So like the regular traverse would go on the
airline western.
Yeah.
Yep. So that would be more northeasterly, I guess.
So she kind of ducked around, past the hut and onto that trail and got in a situation that was just completely irreversible, it seemed like.
Yeah, it was really, really cold. Kate had been above tree line for a significant amount of time, had planned to move with speed and light and fast because speed, we know, equals safety oftentimes, except when things go wrong. And it took a significant amount of time to ascend Adams. I think there was some pretty deep snow through there, some post holing. I have her GPS track that was given to me by New Hampshire Fish and Game, so I was able to put that in Google Earth to really get a sense of the track. But in Madison Call, in particular, the winds coming from the northwest funnel through there. So when Kate left Madison Hut and started to ascend the Star Lake Trail, the wind is to her back. She rounds the corner. She's now in the lee and not feeling the effects, starts up Mount Adams and takes a more direct line off the trail, just a more direct kind of beeline toward the summit, gets to a point where probably was really starting to feel the wind spilling over the summit there in the ridge line, makes the decision to turn around and go back. Now it's ground blizzard conditions. Winds are over 70 plus miles an hour. It's brutally, brutally cold. She's already been above tree line for hours. There's no evidence of hydrating because the water bottles that were found were full and frozen. Just a small amount of food. She did reconnect with Star Lake Trail, but then continued down below it and into a terrain trap, struggled through the terrain trap. And the closer she got back to Madison Call, if you think about what the wind was once at her back, now the winds are 80 plus miles an hour, spilling through that call between Madison and Adams, it was too much to handle, and it shut her down, and she perished there.
I mean, 80-mile-an-hour winds, it'd be like sticking your head out of the window of your car when you're on the interstate.
Yeah, there's this very good video that the observatory has that they've posted on social media showing the different effects of wind speed, headwind on. I think they put a observer out on the observatory, the deck there at the state park building, and you can see 30 miles an hour, 50, 70, 100. And it's to think about encountering winds like that in a self-rescue situation it's harrowing, it's haunting.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just this compounding, I won't even say errors, it's just compounding decisions that are just like, each one just leads to another one, which leads to another one, which eventually creates a scenario where all your chips are gone, right? Like each bet is not paying off, and like you're eventually bust, right? Like,
Yeah.
and how
Yeah.
many people are in that scenario where just one slight decision is a little different, and then it would be one of those days that you talk about, but you don't, oh God, it could have been terrible, and I don't know. It just seems like there's so many spots where it could have been just a slightly different thing would end up with a different outcome.
Yeah, and that really is the case with a lot of these incidents that happen. And Michael Weigert, who he's on Mountain Rescue, you know him. I mean,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah,
a
we know Michael.
great. Oh gosh, he's such a good person, and he's on Mountain Rescue Service. He's a climber, and I'll paraphrase this, but he wrote a piece for a magazine, and it's what he said, and it goes to what you said. It's this series of seemingly inconsequential mistakes that seem, I'm paraphrasing, minor at the time,
Yep.
or go unnoticed altogether, that when that one event that kind of tips it over or breaks the glass happens, all of these series of mistakes that have accumulated on top of one another, just they collapse on themselves, and now we're in a situation is really difficult to untangle from.
And now you got somebody like me sitting in the comfort of my office, like looking at it, being like, look at all these mistakes they made. Like, I made that many mistakes before breakfast today. Like, it just,
Yeah.
it didn't
Yeah.
compound to the end. So like, again, that's what I'm struggling with, is this there, but for the grace of God go I scenario, where like, I've been in this scenario where that's occurred. And I mean, I haven't been in exactly that, but like I've gone places I shouldn't have gone, and it just didn't end up happening badly, and I just forget about it.
Well, and so let's peel back the layers on that, because we can look at an accident and say, okay, this person was speeding or had done what you did. And oftentimes there are these breadcrumbs or these dots that go back weeks, months, years, where something happens, or we make a decision on something that reinforces our beliefs or our confidence level, and it just builds over time and culminates in at something that you would believe was unexpected.
Yeah, but if you look back, if you pull back and you look at the whole picture, it was almost preordained.
Yeah, I think you could argue that, and I think particularly with those of us that have a high degree of personal drive, we get really, really focused on that goal or what we want or don't want, and the blinders go on, and that's all we see.
And you have to, if you want to go do things, I mean, if you're waiting for the perfect scenario, you'll just always be waiting, especially in New Hampshire. If you're waiting for the perfect weather, you will never go and do anything.
Well, yeah.
You have to move the needle a little bit on your decision making if you're just waiting for everything to be perfect.
And this is where climbers who are rescuers, searchers, and they, in a way, they have this understanding when they go out to help others, climbers, like they recognize, look, and many of them most of them have shared experiences where, yeah, I got way out over my experience level, or I had this epic, and they understand that's how we grow. I mean, that's how we get better. That's how we gain wisdom and experience. And it is not by waiting for the perfect day, right? So I think just talking with them about that has been really enriching and meaningful in all of this work.
They're really the heroes in your books. The Mountain Rescue Service, many of whom I know, many of the climbers who are on that, and they'd be off doing their rescue training, and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, it's a gorgeous day. I'm climbing at Waimea. Why are you like going to do your rescue training and all that? And like, now I get it. Like,
Yeah.
this is a way to give back to the community. This is a way to share your knowledge and a way to really help the community of, mountain people in a way that might be unique to somebody who is a good mountaineer, a good alpine climber. That's a way to give back.
Yeah, and I think in the case of the rescuers, many of whom are volunteers that support New Hampshire Fish and Game and the United States Forest Service, but there's this ethos within the rescue community that could be me out there.
Yeah.
And I have a responsibility to serve and help, because it could be me there bringing the litter in for or searching for. And there have been members of, and Rick Wilcox, who I'm sure you know, will tell you that over the course of his experience with Mountain Rescue Service, nine members of Mountain Rescue Service have needed rescue, went out recreating.
Yep.
So they're out there on their own little adventures, and they get in trouble, and they've needed to be helped. And so I think in New Hampshire, it's really unique, it's special. And I would take the position that were it not for the volunteer teams that augment Fish and Game and the Forest Service, I'm not so sure the mountains would be as accessible to us as they are.
These are volunteers who, yeah, they're volunteering on this, but they've, in many cases, just ordered their lives around being in the mountains, right? So like
Yes,
they're
right.
guides, they're people who work in the industry, they're people who spend all their time in the mountains anyway. So like, yeah, they're volunteer rescuers, but they're also people who are always in the mountains.
Yeah, they are. And there's some envy with me, because my work is in risk management and it's not in the mountains. But this passion I have for writing these stories brings me into their living rooms, and I'm just immersed in their mountain culture and their passions for the mountains and the frequency with which they get to go. And it just makes me want to get out there more.
I was really struck with when you've interviewed them and when you've talked to them, their general level of respect for the people they're rescuing. And again, it's easy for me in the comfort of my office to say, make all these choices, and be judgmental, but they're so respectful of the people they're rescuing. And I just think that points to the culture of the mountain rescue.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think they're reflective, because they know they've had those moments where that could have been me, particularly when I was first starting out. I really do think that comes through in these stories about that recognition, that feeling that they have of, I'm out here doing a service because I could have a bad day too.
We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the helicopter pilot in the last traverse.
Yeah.
From a writing standpoint, that was a fantastic bit of writing on your part. Like that, I was so riveted in the description of the helicopter pilot flying in and like hovering this Black Hawk helicopter, which is not a small machine, hovering it like just on the surface of the snow, unbeknownst to, like, doesn't know what's under the snow or whatever, right on this ridge in like massive wind in order to hover there long enough to pick up these two hikers. Like, it was amazing. What a hero.
Pete Cartmel and his crew of three, with these stories, with the Last Traverse and Lions, there are firsts that have happened in our state's history, and some of these things are lasts or hasn't been since, and we can talk about those. But I'm so grateful to the New Hampshire Army National Guard because I was interviewing that crew. This entire crew is one of the most humble group of people you would ever get a chance to sit with. But Matt Stower, who grew up in Concord, New Hampshire, and used to watch the Hueys fly over his house, and that was where his sense of purpose, that's what I want to do. And he became a crew chief on a Black Hawk. But he had since, when I started research, he had since been relocated to the Eastern Army Aviation Training Center at Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And this is where the crews, the pilots go to train. And he arranged for me to visit the base, and they set up, they have a Black Hawk simulator, which is this multi-million-dollar incredible piece of equipment that sits high off the ground. You have to take scaffolding to get into it. And he said, we're going to have you down. We have an expert instructor pilot. We're going to replicate the conditions in the helicopter because the technology's in the simulator because of the technology. And this instructor pilot's going to narrate to you what they're doing. You're going to sit in the co-pilot seat. I'm going to be immediately behind you. And as he's telling you how he's operating the aircraft and why and what he's doing, I'm going to be telling you what I was experiencing and what we were experiencing as a crew as this is all taking place.
Wow.
So you're in this cockpit, the helmet's on, I'm wearing night vision goggles. They replicate this. I have an earpiece in and I'm recording over the audio system. All of this taking place over the course of a couple of hours. And I burned a couple of vacation days to go do this. And It was an amazing experience, and is why I think you're drawn to that particular part of the story.
You put the reader right in there, like you were in there in the simulation. Was it like, could you see, did it have like you could see that you were on the ridge and you could see like the wind blowing the snow, like the ground blizzard happening and all of that?
Yeah, it was, and you could feel now I will not take the position that it was anywhere near what they were dealing with, right, because the bay doors are open. It's Arctic blasts of wind coming through that cabin. It's dark. It's mountain turbulence, which I got a little bit of that, but it was, yes, blowing snow. You have night vision goggles on. The simulators rocking around. It's not so easy for the pilot to make that touch on that peak. That's the first time in our state's history that had ever happened before. Wow. With a helicopter touching down on a summit at nighttime in the White Mountains in winter in full conditions. And it hasn't, there have been very technical helicopter rescues that have happened since, but that is a very unique situation. And this is an aside because they were adamant they said at any point, if you feel motion sickness, you need to tell us, right, you are not going to get sick in this simulator.
This multi-million-dollar simulator. You're not allowed to barf in it, Ty.
Right. Yeah, because you're essentially you're enclosed in this can with these two other people, and everything was fine. And on the way back, we're flying back, and you can see where we're going to touch down back at the base. I must have said, it was either the two words I said or the look on my face, but I'm like, hey guys, and all of a sudden the lights go on, it stops moving, and they're like, get out. And so I did not get sick, but right after that happened, I did have to get in my car and drive back to New Hampshire, which was, there was a little bit of suffering involved in that, but that's what we did. So yeah,
that's what you did to get the story. Yeah,
right. But they're amazing. And Pete Cartmel, the pilot, and I, the New Hampshire Army National Guard has a safety stand down day every year. And this past summer, I think it was August, Pete Cartmel and I did a presentation to the group about that incident and his involvement. And just, I'm standing there with him, and I just wanted to back up and sit down, and just because he's an amazing person, and I'd much rather hear from him than have me up there talking. But it was really special.
That saved James's life, didn't it?
It did. And when we talk about first and last or since, James remains, and this was in 2008, remains the coldest dryland hypothermia victim to ever be fully revived in the northeastern United States. He's one of the coldest in the country. There are colder, but he's on a short list of survivors. I mean, his core temperature was, I think, 76, it might have 76 degrees. I'd have to go back and look, but it's his survival, a combination of the work of the ground rescue team, the Black Hawk pilots, and then Littleton Regional Hospital emergency room staff, which at the time, Littleton Regional was the place you brought hypothermia and frostbite patients out of the White Mountains, and had become nationally and internationally known as a resource for other EDs in the country or expeditions on higher peaks all over the world to call there to tap into those protocols and expertise that had developed over
It
time.
makes sense because of its proximity to the White Mountains and there being so many cases of hypothermia in our area. I mean, like Kate talks about growing up in Buffalo, New York, and it having an amazing cancer hospital. It's like, well, it's because it's in Buffalo, New York, right? Like this is not a very healthy environment. There's a lot of toxins related to the Industrial Revolution and all of the, all of the industry in Buffalo. Like, I think it's the same thing where, we have a lot of examples of hypothermia in the Whites, like even not just in the winter. Hypothermia can happen kind of anytime.
Yeah, I think 50 degrees and lower is kind of the sweet spot is the wrong way to put it, but that is kind of the turning point. And we get a lot of 50-degree days. You get them here, we can get them in the summer. I mean, especially higher up. But I think in the case of Littleton, it was Dr. Harry McDade, and he was a surgeon at Littleton, and he just saw this continuous flow of hypothermia and frostbite coming in. And he said, we've got to do something about this. So he started working with other medical experts, wilderness first responders, wilderness medicine folks, in this small group of folks in New Hampshire and New England. And they just started to try things and work on these different methodologies and treatment protocols. And they developed this really significant set of protocols for hypothermia and frostbite treatment that endures, I think, today.
Wow.
Yes, there have been advancements, but it started with that work.
It's just so much local pride of our mountains and the community and the culture around our mountains. It's really remarkable to be here in New Hampshire among these.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree.
You mentioned there was a first in the Lions of Winter, the rescue there. What was that?
So there are two. So Huntington Ravine and the gullies there, particularly in the wintertime, a huge draw, and especially back then even more so than today maybe. It was the focal point of New England ice climbing. And generally when Huntington climbers would get into trouble, the patterns had developed over time. And search and rescue relies on patterns in the Whites, wind direction, temperature, wind speed, terrain, to help them determine where to find people who are lost or missing. So in the case of Huntington climbers back then, you were found in a couple of different places. You may have been found in on the fan, which is the scree below the gullies, because you fell out or you got injured there, because that is risky terrain. Some would argue it's even more risky than being in the gully itself.
It's avalanche terrain too, right?
Yeah. And people underestimate how steep it is, and you don't crampon up or use your axes until you get to the gully because, okay, that's where the ice is.
Yeah.
But people get in trouble.
Sure.
So they're either found at the base of the fan because they've fallen out of the gully, they've been avalanched out of the gully, they've been found in the gullies themselves on rare occasions, or on Alpine Garden because they topped out and they got pinned by the wind and the cold and they couldn't move. They'd be found in Raymond's Cataract, or they descend out of there because they thought they were descending the escape hatch, or Lionhead. So they're found in the trees in between Raymond and Harvard Cabin, or they're found on Lionhead. So the entire focus of the search for Hugh Herr and Jeff Batzer on that weekend in 1982, who had gone missing in Odell's, that was the point last seen, which is kind of the point from which search and rescue bases their searches. They were working with patterns, because this is what had always happened. Well, Hugh Herr and Jeff Batzer had actually, unknowingly to anybody, made a beeline for the summit of Mount Washington after topping out, which is a second it's you don't generally combine those two things.
Because it's a long ways from the Alpine Garden to the summit. That's
Yep.
thousands of
And the
feet.
days are short, and the winter days are short. And once they encountered this whiteout situation, they didn't know where they were, so they turn, and they believe they're descending back to Huntington. They're using the wind because of the way it was hitting their bodies on the way up. They'd use it a certain way on the way down. Well, it actually kind of drove them over to the top of Great Gulf Wilderness. And so they descend into Great Gulf Wilderness thinking they're descending Central Gully in Huntington Ravine. So it really delayed them being found. And they were only found by it was essentially a miracle. An AMC employee, Cam Bradshaw, who was out just on a day hike to get out of Pinkham Camp, found them.
In Great Gulf on a day hike?
In Great Gulf. Yep.
That's
in Great Gulf. And it's amazing.
That's really remarkable.
In the wintertime, because you don't really go in there.
No, you don't go in there. Like of all the places in the Whites and the Prezzies, like the Great Gulf Wilderness lives up to its name in so many ways. Like it's so much wilderness. Like that whole basin is just, it's sort of like a blank on the map, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And this was the first time and the only time in our state's history where a climber coming out of Huntington that got in trouble, climbers had ever ended up in Great Gulf.
Huh.
It hadn't happened before that, and it hasn't happened since. So this is what an anomaly it is. And then the other first, and thankfully last, is that Albert was Dow was the first member of an organized backcountry search and rescue team in New Hampshire to be killed in the line of duty. It hadn't happened before. Thankfully, it hasn't happened since. And much of that is because of what changed in the wake of his death. But Albert also is only the second member of an organized backcountry search and rescue team in the country to be killed by an avalanche.
Really?
There had been a member of a ski patrol prior to Albert out west on a training exercise that was caught and killed. So it's thankfully, very rare occurrence. And I think much of that has to do with, as I said at the beginning, our understanding of snow science, of avalanche forecasting, of the training that goes into it, and the equipment that's involved in heading into avalanche terrain in the backcountry.
One thing I noticed about your books and the description of just sort of the ramping up of the rescue and the coordination, the logistics of it, the number one thing it seemed like was just do not put the rescuers in harm's way. Like, you're rescuing the hikers or whomever, but you don't want to end up rescuing more, right? Like that's the number one thing.
There isn't, and I used the word ethos earlier, but it's the same in relation to this, that to not create a second crisis, accident, or whatever. And so they are very, very mindful of, and really leverage technology and technical expertise when they're putting searchers into unpredictable terrain. And again, that's all come from what happened 43 years ago, this past January. And it's interesting because some of the criticism directed at the people that are being searched for and rescued, some of the criticism of them comes from, you're putting other people's lives in danger. And I think to a person, in talking with STAR team members over this past almost decade I've been doing this work, they don't feel like their lives are at risk. They're, as you said, these are mountain folks. They are comfortable in this terrain. Yes, do things get gnarly? Do they always go unscathed? No, but by and large, they don't feel like they're out over the edge. They're making methodical, mindful decisions about whether they can go affect this rescue.
I mean, there's just so much in these books, and they're good reads, they're interesting reads, but I think they're also important reads if you spend time in the mountains, especially if you spend time in the White Mountains, just understanding the dynamics involved. It's such an educational thing. I mean, I would recommend anybody pick up any of your books.
Thank you. And I think one of the unexpected things that has come out of this work is what I hear from people, like, it's changing the way I go into the mountains. But parents giving these books to their teenagers who are in driver's education. I work with assisting local government. The organization I work from, New Hampshire, helps local governments manage their risk. One of which is, you have school, municipal, county, and special districts in New Hampshire. And we work with schools, and I find myself more and more in schools talking with students, which is something our organization has. We're generally dealing with staff,
Mm-hmm.
faculty, and public servants, but to be now getting to that next level and talking with middle school and high school students about decision making and risk and using these stories, it's been just a neat overlap of my profession and my passion for writing these stories.
And you're influencing the next generation of explorers to understand the situation they're putting themselves in.
Yeah. Yesterday, ironically, I was up north at one of our member schools, and they have an after-school outdoor survival program, 6th through 12th grade. And I spent a little bit of time with that group talking about backcountry safety, but just overall risk management wherever you find yourself.
I'd also recommend that any of our out west listeners read these books to find out that our mountains are in fact badass.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the summits of which might be lower than the elevation of your couch in, in Estes Park or wherever you are, but they're pretty amazing. They're real mountains.
Yeah, that is awesome. I love that. Thank you.
Do you have any other books in the works? Are you working on anything else?
Yeah, I'm in the midst of, as time allows, I'm in the midst of research on a new book. So just working through that now. And it is, I won't go too far, but it is based out of the White Mountains.
Good. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Well, always my final question, Ty. When you clip carabiners to your harness, do you clip them gates in or gates out?
Gates out.
Gates out.
I think, wait. Now, I think it just depends on what I'm doing and whether I just need to get the carabiner on my harness. And
practical, so pragmatic, and makes sense.
Yeah, right. I think it's gates out. It is gates out.
Okay.
Am I wrong?
All right. I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry to report, but I think you're wrong. I think gates in is the correct way.
All right. Well, there's a little bit of my novice coming through. So
no, I'm very much in the minority. Almost everybody clips their gates out, and I'm like holding true to my gates in status.
Yeah, Jay, that is actually the hardest question you've asked me today because I guess I fumbled it. So yeah.
Oh no, it was good. Well, Ty, where can people find your books? I'll definitely include the link in the show notes.
You can go on my website, which is fullconditionsnh.com. But I would really encourage people to kind of bypass that and go to your local independent bookstore. They're New England. I think they're well stocked here. I think if for the Western listeners, you might have to order it, but I'm all about supporting the independents because they're so supportive of authors and especially local authors.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ty. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting.
This was fun, Jay.
When your next book comes out, let's talk about that one too.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of First Ascent Podcast. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review us on your podcast platform. This is what keeps us going. And if you want more content, we have a Patreon page. You can search First Ascent Pod on Patreon. And finally, you can follow us on Instagram at First Ascent Pod or my personal Instagram at JAYKNOWER. Thanks so much and keep sending.